Fiddle again, and hello, it's Fo, and welcome to Magic Mondays. We've previously looked at decks that have a fair mix of creatures and non-creature spells, but this week we're going to look at a deck that only has 4 creatures and everything else is spells. We're moving up to 3 different colours in our deck, and we're going to be able to take advantage of all of these spells in our 3 different colours that are going to keep us alive until the mid to late game where our creatures are really going to shine. Let's go ahead and take a look at the deck. So our deck is blue, green and red. Our first card is Galvanic Bombardment. For 1 red we can do 2 damage at instant speed, and then once it's in our graveyard, the second Galvanic Bombardment that we play is going to do 3 damage. The third is going to do 4, and the fourth is going to do 5. This will help us kill off our opponent's creatures almost immediately. Second up, we have Thing in the Ice, only 1 copy of. For 1 and 1 blue we get 0/4 wall. It's just a block of ice. Seems simple enough. It starts with 4 counters on it, and every time we cast an instant or sorcery spell, which is the vast majority of our deck, we get to take a counter off of Thing in the Ice. Once we've removed all 4 counters from Thing in the Ice, it transforms. It essentially breaks out of the ice, and we get to see what this thing in the ice really is. It's a massive kraken. So our 7 power creature bounces all non-horror creatures back to their owner's hands. Because we're not playing many other creatures, it's unlikely to affect us, but it will affect our opponent, as there's not many other horror creatures in the format. So we get to return all our opponent's creatures back to their hand, and then we get to swing in with 7 power. Because it's no longer a defender, when it's transformed, it's free to attack. And that's our Thing in the Ice. That's one of our 4 creatures. Next up we have Pull from Tomorrow. At instant speed, we can draw X cards and then discard a card for X and 2 blue. This is going to help us. The more mana we have out, the more cards we can draw. So later on in the game, if we have, say, 5 mana available to us, we can draw 3 cards and discard 1. Disperse lets us bounce target non-land permanent back to its owner's hand. This is especially useful for planeswalkers that we can't bounce with the wall. But we can also use it, as I say, at instant speed. We can use this if a creature is attacking us that we can't do anything about and we don't want to take the damage. We can just bounce it back to their hand. Next up we have Ravaging Blaze. Again at instant speed, for 2 red and X, we can do X damage to target creature. If we have Spell Mastery, meaning we already have 2 instants or sorceries in our graveyard when we play Ravaging Blaze, then the X damage gets replicated onto our opponent as well. With most of the cards in our deck being instants or sorceries, we're going to have this Spell Mastery requirement most of the time, so we're going to be able to play this Ravaging Blaze with both effects. Next up is one of our combo pieces. This is Fling. For 1 and 1 red, we can sacrifice a creature. An opponent takes damage equal to that creature's power. So if we have, say, our Awoken Horror with 7 power, if we play Fling and sacrifice our Awoken Horror, then we can do 7 damage to our opponent. Ideally in our games, we'll be able to swing in with the creature and then sacrifice it with Fling. Fling doesn't care if the creature's untapped, so we could, in theory, flip our wall into the Awoken Horror, attack for 7, and then fling it at our opponent to do a following 7 damage, to do them 14 in 1 turn. Grapple with the Past is our first green spell. For 1 and 1 green, we get to flip the top 3 cards of our library into our graveyard, and then get a land or a creature back from our graveyard into our hand. So if we play this first with nothing in our graveyard, we still get to flip over 3 cards, so there's something for us to take back. It's very useful for us to get our 3rd land for the start of turn 3. If we only have 2 lands in hand plus a Grapple with the Past and we're able to cast it because one of those lands is green, we're able to get our 3rd land. Also in the later game, if one of our creatures is destroyed, we can get that back too. Displacement Wave lets us bounce all non-land permanents with casting cost X back to their owner's hands for X and 2 blue. It's sorcery speed, not instant speed, so we can't use it as our opponent's creatures are attacking us. But it's a good tempo play almost at any time that forces our opponent to have to recast their permanents in their following turn. Puts them back. It's a good tempo play. It gives us opportunity to survive a little bit longer, keep our opponent's threats away till we can get our own on the go. Take inventory, much like Galvanic Bombardment, works the same way. Take inventory 1 and 1 blue, we get to draw a card to replace it, and that's fine enough. The second time we play it, we get to draw 2 cards. The third time we play it, we get to draw 3 cards. And the fourth time, we get to draw 4 cards. Helps us generate card advantage. And really, we want as many instants or sorceries going into our graveyard as possible to set us up for our combo in the mid to late game. Along with Fling, Enigma Drake is the second part of our combo. This is our other 3 creatures that make up our 4 creature deck. 3 copies of the Enigma Drake. His toughness is 4, and his power is equal to the number of instants and sorceries in our graveyard. So that's why we want to keep putting cards into our graveyard. If our opponent has Sphinx's Tutelage, that's fine. We're going to be quite happy with letting cards go into our graveyard. If the Enigma Drake himself goes into our graveyard, we've got Grapple with the Past, and we've got another spell that can get him back. And he pairs with Fling, so if we've got 20 instants or sorceries in our graveyard, we can just fling the Enigma Drake at our opponent. Pulsa Marasa, another way to get back either a land or an Enigma Drake, or potentially our wall if we'd rather do that. For 2 and 1 green, we get the privilege of also gaining 6 life. And that's going to again keep us alive until a later game, until we can pull off our combo. Next up, we have Pieces of the Puzzle. For 2 and 1 blue, we get to look at the top 5 cards of our library, choose any 2 instants or sorceries that we need at the time, depending on circumstance, and put them into our hand. The rest of the cards go into the graveyard. If we have one of our green spells that lets us get something back, then we don't mind if an Enigma Drake, one of our creatures, goes into the graveyard because we can always get it back. And even if all 5 are relevant instants or sorceries, again, we don't care about 3 extra ones going to our graveyard. We can even deliberately put Galvanic Bombardment or Take Inventory into the graveyard to make the following copies more powerful. Radiant Flames is very good in a 3-color deck. For 2 and a red, it does X damage to each creature, dependent on how many different colours of mana were used to cast the spell. So, because we're playing 3 different colours, and the spell costs 3 altogether, if we spend a green mana, a blue mana, and a red mana on the spell, it'll do 3 damage to all creatures. And it's a good way of wiping away all our opponent's creatures, but leaving ours alive, because all of our creatures have 4 toughness. If any of our opponent's creatures survive, we can often finish them off with Galvanic Bombardment. Next up we have Collective Defiance. It is the spell that has 3 modes available to us. So for 1 and 2 red mana, we can choose to do one of these modes, but we can choose an additional mode if we pay 1 extra colourless mana, or all 3 modes we can get out of this spell for spending 3 colourless mana and 2 red. So we've got 5 altogether. We can choose all 3 of these modes. We can either do 4 damage to a creature that our opponent controls, we can do 3 damage to them directly, or we can discard our entire hand if we've got nothing good and draw that many cards. Or if we think our opponent has a good hand, or they've gone specifically to look for a card to put into their hand, we could use it on our opponent to make them discard their entire hand and draw new cards, hopefully worse ones. So there will be times that we can use all 3 modes of the spell, but generally we're only going to want to use 1 or 2. But it's very versatile. We've only got 1 copy in the deck, but when it turns up, it should be able to get us out of any sticky situations. If even 4 damage isn't enough to destroy a creature that our opponent controls, Devouring Flames gives us the option to do 5 damage, and that should cover most of the creatures in the format. It can also do the damage to a planeswalker that our opponent controls. So if we're not able to bounce a planeswalker away back to their hand, then we can deal with it this way. It does require us to bounce a land back to our hand when we play it, and that does put us off tempo, but at the same time, it's worth it in some situations where we don't have many other answers. There are some creatures in the format that have 5 toughness, and we're going to need to deal with them that way. So if we're not burning our things, we've got another option to bounce. Crush the Tentacles, for 6, lets us bounce everything back to the owner's hands, all non-land permanents. It also has a surge cost. Surge cost applies if this is the second spell that we've cast in the same turn. So if we have 6 mana, but we have a 1 mana spell like Galvanic Bombardment, we could play Galvanic Bombardment first, then play Crush Your Tentacles for its surge cost, and then we get a bonus of getting an 8/8 Octopus token. So if our opponent has a small creature that we can kill off with a Galvanic Bombardment, and then we play this, all the other creatures that are on the field, even our own, will go back to hand, and then all that will be left will be an 8/8 Octopus token, much like when the Awoken Horror turns into the 7/8 and bounces everything back. We wouldn't be able to attack with the 8/8 Octopus straight away because it'll still have Summoning Sickness, but it's still a good way of undoing everything that our opponent's done, putting them back a turn, making them cast everything all over again, and they'll be fighting against an 8/8, which is going to be fairly difficult for them. Last but not least, we've got 2 copies of Rise from the Tides. This is good when all our other plans have failed, when we've not managed to kill them off with the Drake or the Awoken Horror, and we've not managed to fling for that final damage. Rise from the Tides lets us put X 2/2 zombie token creatures onto the battlefield tapped, where X is the number of instants and sorceries in our graveyard. So by the time we have 6 mana to cast Rise from the Tides, we're bound to have several instants and sorceries in the graveyard. Sometimes it can be 10 or 12 instants of sorceries that are already in the graveyard, and this generates so many zombie tokens that they're just overwhelmed on the following turns and they can't really stop it. Onto our lands, we've got islands, we've got mountains, we've got forests, then we've got a couple of dual lands that help us fix our mana. It's important that we get access to all 3 colours of our mana base fairly immediately. Root Brown Crag will help us do this if we already have a forest or a mountain in play. It can come in untapped and we can get either. Same with Hinterland Harbour, but it works for green and blue. If we already have a forest or an island in play, and then we play this card, it'll come in untapped and give us access to both. And then same here with Sulphur Falls, but it's for blue and red. So if we can get these out fairly early along with our basic lands, we're going to be able to bring them in untapped, have access to all 3 colours of our mana so we can get our cards online as fast as possible. So we can get access to Radiant Flames for 3, etc. Evolving Wilds is an all-star in multicoloured decks. We've got 4 copies in. Because we're playing 3 different colours, we're really going to want access to those different types of mana. So we can play an Evolving Wilds first, go and get a basic land for the colour that we're likely to need first. Then we can follow it up with our other basics from our hand, or perhaps one of our dual lands, and we won't be stuck with spells in our hand that we won't be able to play. And that's our deck. So as we've seen, we can draw our way through the deck, getting rid of all our spells to get more cards. We can hold off our opponent's creatures and their attacks, and then as we get into the mid to late game, we can get out our Enigma Drake. We'll be fueled by all these spells being in our graveyard, and then we can use our fling to fire our Enigma Drake at our opponent, even in response to our opponent trying to kill our Enigma Drake, or after we've attacked with it, and we can hopefully do lethal damage this way. Pulling off combos isn't a surefire thing, but when you can do it, it's devastating, and it's very satisfying. So we'll play a few games with the deck against the computer, perhaps against a real world opponent. We'll talk our way through them, we'll see how it goes. But I'll split that up, and we'll see that video later on in the week. Until then, take it easy, and I'll see you soon.